Okay, so welcome back to another episode of Intellectual Property. This is Class 9. We're going to be talking about the second of these substantive requirements or substantive elements of patentability, namely the utility requirement. So in the last class, we talked about patentable subject matter, or the classes or kinds of things that can be the subject of patent protection. In today's class, we're going to talk about one of the fundamental requirements or one of the fundamental expectations imposed on an invention or discovery before patent protection can apply, namely that an invention under the Patent Act is patentable if and only if it is useful, right? So then the question becomes, A, what do we mean by useful? And B, why have a usefulness requirement in the first place? And maybe we can start with the second question by asking what purpose is this supposed to serve, right? I mean, after all, why would anyone go to the trouble of patenting an invention or discovery if it wasn't useful? I mean, it takes a great deal of time. It takes a significant investment of money. There's a great deal of uncertainty involved. Why would you go to all the trouble of applying for and obtaining a patent in something if there wasn't anything you could do with it in the first place? Just a waste of money, no purpose. Why? It doesn't make any sense. Why worry about this in the first place? Well, fundamentally, the concern is, well, people might apply for patents and things that aren't useful now, but might potentially become useful in the future. In other words, you might try to kind of stake out some territory in the anticipation that uses might develop in the future, even if those uses don't exist today. There's plenty of things you could identify where you might suspect that potentially a compound or a process or any other kind of potentially patentable invention or discovery might conceivably become useful, but isn't, even if it isn't necessarily useful today. And we don't want to enable people to take out property protection over a invention or discovery unless they've actually identified a way in which that invention or discovery can actually be used. In other words, thinking about use is part of the goal of patent policy. In other words, by putting this usefulness requirement on patents, we say to inventors, not only do you have to figure out how to do something, but you have to figure out at least something that you can do with it. There has to be a purpose. There has to be a reason for you to claim ownership over this thing that you're claiming. And in the absence of a reason or a use related to what you're claiming, we're not going to allow you to take out ownership. In other words, you've got to figure out at least one thing you can do with it. Now, of course, if you later come up with other things, that's great too, right? But other people are also going to be in a position to do that too, right? So if other people identify other uses, those other inventors could also take out patents with respect to that particular use and potentially get, for example, a blocking patent, right? So we look at the usefulness requirement as kind of requiring effectively inventors to not just stake out territory, but actually think about how the inventive activity they're engaging in is actually going to benefit the public. Okay, and what that means is that there has to actually be a use for the invention or discovery in question when the application is filed. In other words, the application itself has to show how the invention or discovery is useful. And that comes up in the context of Brenner v. Manson. So what happened here, right? Well, we have two inventors, Ringgold and Rosencrantz, who've patented a process for making a particular enzyme that is used in various pharmaceutical contexts, various therapeutic contexts. They invented it in 1956, they patented it, they obtained the patent in 1957, and then Manson comes along later and says, hey, wait a minute, right? I took out a Mexican patent for this very same compound prior to the patenting or invention by Ringgold and Rosencrantz. Ergo, I have priority to them, and I'm going to apply for what's known as an interference. That's essentially Manson saying, under the 1952 Act at the time, America was the first to invent system, and therefore, if Manson had invented the compound in question prior to the two patent owners, he was actually entitled to be the patent owner himself rather than them. And so he could, in effect, take the patent away from them. The question was whether Manson was entitled to own a patent in the first place. And the response was, well, kind of went back and forth. The patent office said no, right? Both the examiner and the appeals board said no, right? You haven't disclosed any use, therefore you don't get a patent, right? The the appeals board, or rather the appeals court, the Court of Claims and Patent Appeals, reversed on the ground that Manson disclosed how to make the compound, and essentially its holding was, look, what he's disclosed or what he's claiming in the patent is a method of making the compound. Therefore, it's useful insofar as the method produces the compound. It's used for the compound, so presto, that's useful, sufficient for the statute. Supreme Court reverses again and denies the patent, upholding the patent office's initial decision, saying ultimately a patent over the process is really just amounts to a patent over the compound itself. And what Manson wants is ownership of the compound itself. But the problem is, at the time that he took out his, he made his initial invention and took out this Mexican patent, he hadn't disclosed, he hadn't identified any actual uses, right? He was looking for a way to make this steroid because it was related to other steroids that had certain therapeutic uses, and he figured, well, if related compounds have medical uses, then this compound might have medical uses as well, and why not stake out a claim and say it belongs to me, and therefore when other uses pop up, I'll have ownership and I'll be able to license it to the people who want to use it. Now, it turned out that there were, in fact, therapeutic uses for the compound in question. The problem was that Manson hadn't identified them, and Ringgold and Rosencrantz did, right? So the problem from Manson's perspective with respect to patentability was that he was sort of looking at this patent claim as kind of staking out territory without actually doing anything to realize the actual value of the patent. He just wanted to own the property. He wanted to own the territory, as it were, rather than actually disclose anything useful to the public. And the Supreme Court said that just isn't enough, right? You have to show a use when you actually invent or invent or discover what you're disclosing. And it's not enough that it turns out to be useful later. Really, what we want to incentivize in the patenting process is not just the invention or discovery, but the operationalization, as it were, of the invention or discovery. We want to see inventors actually figure out what to do with something, and until they do, they're not entitled to a patent, right? The usefulness requirement hasn't been satisfied. Now, of course, usefulness can mean a lot of different things in different contexts, and really any kind of use will do, with certain limited exceptions, specifically that patent protection doesn't go to inventions that are illegal or fraudulent or in some way intended to mislead or do something improper, right? So you can't patent illegal things because illegal uses aren't the kinds of legitimate uses that are consistent with patenting, but you can patent pretty much any other kind of use, right? So basically any use will do, even a really trivial use, or even a really silly use, or even a really inefficient use. It doesn't have to be the best way of accomplishing something, it just has to be a way of accomplishing something, right? So, the usefulness requirement is necessary, right? But not necessarily a particularly high bar. The question then becomes, what counts as misleading, improper, fraudulent, etc.? So here's one of my favorite cases in the class, really. Juicy Whip v. Orange Bang. So what happened here? You've probably been to like a convenience store, a 7-Eleven, or, whatever, a bowling alley, and you've seen the drink machines that have the swirling, attractive drinks sitting on top of them, swishing around with some ice and some stuff in it. You're like, oh, it looks so nice and cold and refreshing, and I really want to have some of that drink. Well, it turns out Juicy Whip took out a patent on a dispenser that separated the swirling juice stuff from the actual juice that got dispensed. So traditionally, as you can imagine, right, there's swirling juice in the container, the swirling juice gets dispensed, and you get whatever's coming out of the container swirling around. It turns out there's some problems with that, right? Because for one thing, the mixture in the device is susceptible to contamination, right? I mean, if it's sitting in there, it's kind of open. It could get dirt or other kinds of bacteria in there. So it's got to get changed out relatively frequently, right? It's also really hard to clean, right? So you've got this swirling, sticky, sweet thing. You've got to clean it out on a regular basis and refill it with new juice mixture and so on and so forth. Juicy Whip had a way around the problem. So what they did is they put a non-comestible, basically non-edible mixture in the top that kind of swished around and looked really nice to look at and made people think that that's what they were buying. But in fact, it was what's known as a post-mix dispenser, in which, as you can see in the patent drawing on the left, the juice mix and the related, all the other components, including the presumably carbonated water and other things, were actually hidden underneath the machine, and that's where the dispensing actually came from, right? So the consumers think that what they're getting is something dispensed from the machine, getting dispensed from the tub, but what they're actually getting is something dispensed from separate, sanitary, clean, don't have to wash them, et cetera, dispensers that are hidden down below, right? So their consumers aren't getting what they want, right? But they are getting effectively more or less what they think they're getting, except it's just coming from a different source. Okay, well, Orange Bang starts manufacturing a functionally identical machine. You can see a version of it on the right. And Juicy Whip sues them for patent infringement, saying, look, we have a patent over post-mix dispensers, right? You've now made a post-mix dispenser without licensing our patent. That's infringing, and you have to license from us or we're going to stop you from doing it. And Orange Bang's response is, no, it ain't, because your patent's invalid. Why is it invalid? Well, the only use for your patent is to fool consumers about the source of the juice mix that they're drinking, right? So Juicy Whip didn't invent the tub with the stuff swirling around, and Juicy Whip didn't invent the dispenser that was hidden down below. Juicy Whip just invented combining the two. So you got the visual appeal of the tub, and you got the cleanliness and ease of the post-mix dispenser smashed into one, right? Two great tastes that go great together. This is the way to go from the Juicy Whip perspective. They think that, this is going to appeal to consumers visually, but it's also going to be better for the vendor, who has lower expenses and less cleaning and less risk of sanitation problems. And ultimately, the consumer is going to get a better product. Orange Bang says, no, you're defrauding consumers, right? When consumers go to use this machine, the consumers think that they're getting a product from the tub, and they're not. You're giving them something totally different, right? And that's just straight up fraudulent. To tell consumers you're giving them one thing and actually give them something else, you can't do that. That's not a utility. That's not a use. That's patentable, right? The only purpose for the invention that you're claiming is to mislead consumers about the source of the product they're consuming. Well, the Federal Circuit is having none of it, right? It says, that's not what we mean, and that's not what the law means by fraudulent, right? It's fraudulent essentially only if it's illegal, right? Only if you're breaking the law by what you're doing. Here, yes, consumers may be misunderstanding where the product is coming from, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, right? They don't need to know, right? They're getting a better product. This isn't intended to harm consumers. It's actually intended to just make the market more effective. And the Federal Circuit says, That's not what we mean by fraudulent. This isn't a wrongful invention or an invention used for wrongful purposes. It's actually used for beneficial purposes, even if consumers are misunderstanding the nature of what it is that they're getting. So I'll leave you with a little video to ask yourselves about. So we can also think that the USPTO has some guidelines for the utility requirement. We'll talk about those in the discussion in class, and I will leave you with a video to think about whether or not this is a useful machine for the purpose of the Patent Act.